Welcome to Shadows of America, where history's darkest secrets come to light. In the spring of 1889, in the small Kentucky town of Harlan, in the Appalachian Mountains, Reverend Isaiah Crawford was found dead in the basement of his church from what appeared to be a self-inflicted gunshot wound. Crawford had served as the pastor of Harlan Baptist Church for 14 years, delivering sermons every Sunday, performing marriages and funerals, and hearing the private confessions of his congregation members who came to him seeking spiritual guidance and forgiveness for their sins. His death initially seemed to be a tragedy of a man, overwhelmed by the burden of his calling, perhaps driven to despair by the weight of hearing so many confessions and carrying so many secrets. But when church elders entered the basement to prepare Crawford's body for burial, they discovered something that would devastate the small mountain community and would reveal that Crawford had betrayed every principle of pastoral confidentiality and spiritual trust. The church basement, which Crawford had used as his private study and which he had always kept locked, contained detailed written records of every confession he had heard during his 14 years as Harlan's pastor. Hundreds of leather-bound journals filled with Crawford's precise handwriting documented the sins that congregation members had confessed to him in private: adultery, theft, violence, secret hatreds, shameful acts, forbidden desires. Names, dates, and graphic details were all meticulously recorded, creating an archive of the community's darkest secrets that Crawford had preserved rather than keeping confidential as his pastoral role required. But the journals contained more than just transcribed confessions. Crawford had added his own commentary and judgments, describing congregation members in cruel and contemptuous terms, expressing disgust at their sins, while simultaneously seeming to take pleasure in knowing their secrets. And most disturbingly, the journals documented how Crawford had used the confessions he had heard to manipulate and control members of his congregation, threatening to reveal their secrets if they didn't comply with his demands for money, for labor on church projects, or for support of his positions in community disputes. The discovery revealed that for 14 years, Isaiah Crawford had abused his position as a trusted spiritual leader, had violated the sacred confidentiality of confession, and had blackmailed and manipulated the people who had come to him seeking forgiveness and guidance. His suicide appeared to have been prompted by fear that his system of control was about to be exposed, choosing death over facing the consequences of what he had done. Before we continue with the complete investigation into Reverend Isaiah Crawford and the 14 years he spent recording and exploiting his congregation's confessions in Harlan, Kentucky, subscribe to Shadows of America. We release documentaries daily, because what was found in that church basement raises profound questions about trust, about the abuse of spiritual authority, and about how communities can be controlled through fear of exposure when their deepest secrets are held by someone they believed would protect them. Harlan, Kentucky in the 1870s and 1880s was a small mountain town with a population of approximately 800 people, located in the coal mining region of southeastern Kentucky near the Virginia border. The community was predominantly Protestant, with several small Baptist and Methodist churches serving families who worked in the coal mines or who farmed the difficult mountain terrain. Life was hard, isolation was significant, and the churches served as central institutions, providing not just spiritual guidance, but also social connection and community organization. Isaiah Crawford had arrived in Harlan in 1875 at age 38, answering the Harlan Baptist Church's call for a new pastor after their previous minister had died. Crawford presented credentials showing he had been educated at a Baptist seminary in Tennessee and had previous pastoral experience in small rural churches. The church's search committee had been impressed by Crawford's biblical knowledge, his powerful preaching style, and his apparent dedication to serving a remote mountain community, and they had hired him enthusiastically. For the first years of Crawford's ministry, he appeared to be an effective and devoted pastor, His sermons were forceful and focused on sin and redemption, emphasizing the need for confession and repentance. He established a practice of private pastoral counseling sessions where congregation members could confess their sins and receive spiritual guidance, a practice that was common in Protestant churches of the era, even though formal sacramental confession was more associated with Catholic tradition. Crawford framed these sessions as essential for spiritual health, encouraging congregation members to share their deepest sins and struggles with him, so he could pray with them and help them find forgiveness. But Crawford's journals, written from the beginning of his tenure in Harlan, reveal that he had never intended to keep these confessions confidential. The first journal entry, dated September 1875, just weeks after his arrival, documents a confession from a church deacon about financial impropriety in his business dealings. Crawford recorded the confession in detail and added a note: "Knowledge is power. The secrets of this congregation will be my foundation." This early entry suggests Crawford arrived in Harlan already planning to collect and exploit confessions rather than developing this practice gradually over time. Crawford's method was systematic and calculated. He would encourage confession by preaching sermons about the necessity of unburdening one's soul, about the spiritual danger of hidden sin, and about the relief and freedom that came from confessing to a trusted spiritual guide. He presented himself as completely trustworthy, as someone bound by God and by pastoral duty to keep confessions absolutely confidential. He quoted scripture about the seal of confession and about the sacred trust between pastor and congregant, creating an environment where people felt safe sharing their darkest secrets with him. Then Crawford would transcribe the confessions into his journals immediately after each counseling session, recording not just the basic facts, but also his observations about the confessor's demeanor, his assessments of their character, and his judgments about their sins. The journals show Crawford developing a comprehensive knowledge of the private lives, hidden acts, and secret thoughts of most of his congregation, creating what amounted to a detailed database of vulnerability and shame that he could exploit. The exploitation began subtly. Crawford would use knowledge from confessions to inform his sermons in ways that felt personally directed at specific congregation members, creating discomfort and ensuring they knew he remembered their confessions. He would make oblique references to people's secrets in casual conversation, never quite revealing what he knew, but making clear he knew something, keeping people anxious and compliant. He would offer spiritual guidance that happened to involve actions that benefited Crawford personally, suggesting that someone who had confessed greed should donate more money to the church, or that someone who had confessed laziness should volunteer more hours for church projects. As Crawford became more confident, his exploitation became more direct. His journals document multiple instances where he threatened explicitly to reveal confessions if people didn't comply with his demands. When a church member questioned Crawford's spending of church funds, Crawford threatened to reveal the man's confession about an extramarital affair from years earlier. When a wealthy widow considered leaving the congregation to attend a different church, Crawford threatened to reveal her confession about having been responsible for her husband's death through neglect. These threats were effective because Crawford's position gave him credibility. If he publicly claimed that someone had confessed terrible sins to him, the community would believe him, even if the accused person denied it. By the mid-1880s, approximately 10 years into his ministry, Crawford had developed an elaborate system of control over his congregation. He had confessions from dozens of families, giving him leverage over a substantial portion of the community. He used this leverage to ensure his continued employment, despite some congregation members questioning his character and methods, to extract financial contributions that made him relatively wealthy by Harlan standards, and to maintain power over church governance and community decision-making. People who wanted to oppose Crawford found themselves unable to do so because he held secrets that would destroy their reputations and their families if revealed. The psychological impact on congregation members was severe. Many people who had confessed to Crawford lived in constant fear that their secrets would be revealed, creating anxiety that affected their health and their ability to function normally. Some avoided church entirely, unable to face Crawford knowing he held their secrets, but this absence itself created suspicion and gossip that drove them back. The act of confession, which should have provided spiritual relief, instead created ongoing bondage to Crawford's control. Crawford's journals reveal his awareness that he was causing harm, and his complete lack of remorse about it. He wrote extensively about his contempt for his congregation, describing them as weak and sinful, and deserving of his manipulation. He framed his blackmail as righteous punishment for their sins, as if he were God's instrument for ensuring they suffered appropriate consequences. This self-righteous framing allowed Crawford to maintain his sense of moral authority, while systematically betraying the trust placed in him. The beginning of Crawford's downfall came in early 1889, when a young woman named Sarah Mitchell came to Crawford to confess that she was pregnant out of wedlock. According to later testimony from Sarah's family, Crawford demanded that Sarah name her father as the one responsible, threatening to publicly expose her as promiscuous if she didn't comply with his version of events. Sarah refused, insisting on telling the truth about who had actually fathered her child. Crawford threatened more explicitly, telling Sarah he would reveal other confessions her family members had made, destroying her entire family's reputation unless she did as he ordered. Sarah left that meeting and went directly to her father, telling him about Crawford's threats and about her suspicion that Crawford had records of the family's confessions. Her father, James Mitchell, was a man with some education and with contacts outside Harlan's isolated community. Mitchell began quietly investigating Crawford, speaking with other congregation members about whether they had experienced similar threats. What he discovered was that many families had been subjected to Crawford's blackmail over the years, but fear of exposure had kept them silent and prevented them from comparing experiences. Mitchell organized a group of affected families who agreed to confront church elders about Crawford's behavior. In March 1889, this group met with the church's board of deacons and presented testimony about Crawford's threats and his systematic exploitation of confessions. The deacons were initially skeptical, unable to believe their pastor capable of such betrayal, but the consistency of the accounts and the desperation of the families making the accusations convinced the deacons that an investigation was necessary. The deacons confronted Crawford on March 15, 1889, telling him about the accusations and demanding to search his study in the church basement. Crawford refused, claiming pastoral privilege and arguing that his private papers were protected by spiritual confidentiality. But the deacons had legal advice, suggesting that Crawford's study was church property and that they had authority to access it. They gave Crawford an ultimatum: allow the search voluntarily, or they would force entry and involve civil authorities. Crawford asked for time to pray and consider the situation. The deacons, still respecting his position despite their suspicions, granted him until the following day. That night, Crawford apparently spent hours in his basement study, perhaps reviewing his journals, perhaps considering his options. At some point during that night, he wrote a brief note that was later found on his desk. The weight of their sins has broken me. I could not carry them any longer. Then he shot himself with a pistol he kept in his study, dying instantly. When the deacons forced entry to the basement study the following morning, they found Crawford's body, and they found the journals. The full scope of what Crawford had been doing became clear as they reviewed the detailed records of 14 years of confessions. The journals were organized meticulously, with indices listing congregation members and cross-references to their various confessions. Crawford's handwriting filled thousands of pages, documenting the intimate secrets of hundreds of people, many of whom were still living in Harlan, and who would be devastated to learn that their confessions had been recorded and potentially could be revealed. The church elders faced an agonizing decision about what to do with the journals. Destroying them would protect the privacy of everyone whose confessions were documented, but it would also destroy evidence of Crawford's crimes and would prevent any accountability or understanding of what he had done. Preserving them would allow investigation, but would create permanent records of private confessions that could potentially be leaked or misused in the future. Some families demanded the journals be destroyed immediately. Others wanted to see what Crawford had written about them, needing to know what information he had held over them. The decision was eventually made to preserve the journals under seal in the church's custody, with access restricted to church elders and to families who specifically requested to see entries about themselves. This compromise satisfied no one completely, but seemed like the best balance between protecting privacy and preserving evidence. Many families chose to view their entries in the journals, needing closure and confirmation of what Crawford had known about them. The experience of reading Crawford's contemptuous commentary about their confessions was traumatic for most, confirming that he had violated their trust in the worst possible way. The investigation into Crawford's background revealed that he had been asked to leave his previous pastoral position in Tennessee under suspicious circumstances involving financial impropriety, but this information hadn't been communicated to Harlan Baptist Church when they had hired him. Better communication between churches and better vetting of pastoral candidates might have prevented Crawford from obtaining another position where he could abuse trust. The case contributed to Baptist organizations developing more formal processes for credentialing and oversight of clergy. The psychological damage to Harlan's community was profound and lasting. The revelation that their pastor had been systematically betraying their trust and exploiting their vulnerabilities for 14 years destroyed many people's ability to trust religious authorities or to participate in organized religion. Church attendance at Harlan Baptist dropped dramatically after Crawford's death, and the church struggled to find a replacement pastor willing to serve a congregation dealing with such trauma. Some families left Harlan entirely, unable to remain in a community where their secrets were known and documented, even if the journals were sealed. The practice of private confession to Protestant pastors, which had been common in rural churches like Harlan Baptist, became viewed with suspicion after the Crawford case. Many congregation members who had previously valued confession as a spiritual practice found they could no longer trust pastors enough to share intimate information with them. This loss of an important pastoral care practice had negative spiritual and psychological effects, leaving people without appropriate outlets for processing guilt and seeking spiritual guidance. The question of whether Crawford's suicide note, "The weight of their sins has broken me," represented genuine remorse, or was a final manipulation has been debated. Some interpreted the note as indicating Crawford finally recognized the harm he had caused and chose death over facing consequences. Others interpreted it as Crawford's final attempt to frame his actions as pastoral burden rather than as betrayal, as if he had been the victim of his congregation's sins rather than being the perpetrator of systematic abuse. His journal's content, which showed no remorse up until the final days, suggests the note was more likely manipulation than genuine repentance. Crawford's widow, Elizabeth, who had apparently been unaware of her husband's journals and his blackmail system, faced ostracism and suspicion after his death. Some community members blamed her for not recognizing what her husband was doing, while others viewed her as another victim who had been deceived by Crawford's double life. Elizabeth eventually left Harlan and returned to her family in Tennessee, unable to remain in a community where her husband's crimes had caused so much harm. The financial audit of Crawford's estate revealed that he had accumulated unusual wealth for a small-town pastor, strongly suggesting He had been extracting money from congregation members through blackmail, but the complexity of proving which financial transactions had been voluntary donations versus coerced payments, and the reluctance of victims to testify publicly about their confessions and Crawford's threats meant that the full extent of his financial crimes was never fully documented. His estate was eventually settled, with significant portions going to the church to compensate for documented financial irregularities. Modern understanding of psychological manipulation and spiritual abuse provides frameworks for understanding Crawford's behavior that weren't available in 1889. Crawford demonstrated characteristics now associated with malignant narcissism and with abusive religious leaders. He used position of trust to access vulnerable information. He exploited that information for personal gain and for sense of power. He showed no genuine empathy for his victims, and he framed his abuse as righteous action that his victims deserved. His case exemplifies patterns that have been documented in many cases of clergy abuse across various religious traditions. The theological questions raised by Crawford's case include how communities can distinguish between legitimate pastoral authority and abusive control, and what safeguards are necessary to prevent religious leaders from exploiting their positions. Protestant theology emphasizes the priesthood of all believers and individual relationship with God, rather than dependence on clergy as intermediaries. But in practice, rural communities like Harlan granted their pastors significant authority that could be abused when combined with isolation and lack of oversight. The practice of keeping confession confidential, while generally important for maintaining trust between clergy and congregants, can be exploited by manipulative religious leaders who use the confidentiality to hide their own abuse. Modern best practices for clergy include mandatory reporting requirements for certain serious crimes or dangers, consultation with other clergy or supervisors about challenging pastoral situations, and limits on individual clergy's unmonitored access to vulnerable people. None of these safeguards existed in 1889. Harlan, leaving Crawford free to operate without oversight for 14 years. The legal framework for prosecuting clergy who abused their positions was underdeveloped in 1889. While blackmail was clearly illegal, proving it required victims to testify about both the confessions Crawford held over them and about his threats, forcing them to publicly reveal the very secrets they feared having exposed. This catch-22 effectively protected abusive clergy from prosecution by making it impossible for victims to seek legal recourse without destroying their own reputations. Modern victim protection measures and sealed court proceedings help address this problem, but weren't available in the 19th century. The impact on individual families who were victimized by Crawford varied widely. Some marriages survived the revelation that secrets had been shared with Crawford and had been recorded in his journals. Others fell apart when spouses learned about confessions that had been kept secret from them, as well as from Crawford. Children learned disturbing information about their parents when family secrets were revealed. The disruption to family relationships caused by Crawford's betrayal of confidence extended far beyond the immediate trauma of knowing he had violated their trust. The destruction of social trust within Harlan's community was one of the most damaging long-term effects. People who had been friends for years began suspecting each other, wondering what secrets might be documented in Crawford's journals, whether those secrets might be revealed, despite the journals being sealed. Business relationships became strained when people wondered whether partners or competitors had confessed to financial misdeeds. The community cohesion that had been a source of strength in the difficult mountain environment was severely damaged by the knowledge that intimate secrets had been documented and might become known. The few individuals in Harlan who hadn't confessed anything to Crawford, either because they were genuinely without significant sins to confess, or because they had been suspicious of Crawford and had avoided the practice, found themselves in an awkward position. They were spared the direct trauma of having their confessions documented, but they were still part of a community dealing with collective trauma and loss of trust. Their intact trust in religious authority wasn't shared by most of their neighbors, creating division between those who remained able to participate in religious community and those who no longer could. The Harlan Baptist Church eventually called a new pastor in 1891, 2 years after Crawford's death. The new pastor, Reverend Thomas Green, faced the difficult task of rebuilding trust and helping a traumatized community heal. Green explicitly refused to hear private confessions, encouraging congregation members instead to process their spiritual struggles through prayer, through scripture reading, and through confession directly to God, rather than through clerical intermediary. This refusal to hear confessions was necessary for rebuilding trust, but meant the congregation lost a pastoral care practice that, when not abused, could provide genuine spiritual and psychological benefit. The archives containing Crawford's journals remain in the custody of descendants of the original church elders, with access continuing to be tightly restricted. Historians and psychologists interested in studying spiritual abuse and in understanding 19th-century religious practice in Appalachian communities have requested access, but these requests have generally been denied to protect the privacy of descendants of people whose confessions were documented. The journal's existence is known, and their general content has been described in various histories, but the specific confessions remain sealed. The question of whether Crawford's victims would have been better served by complete destruction of the journals versus by preservation under seal has been debated. Destruction would have provided absolute assurance that the confessions could never be revealed, but would have left victims without the closure that came from seeing exactly what Crawford had written about them. Preservation provided that closure and provided evidence of Crawford's systematic abuse, but created ongoing anxiety that the journals might someday be accessed improperly or might leak. There was no perfect solution to this dilemma. The parallel between Crawford's practice of recording confessions and modern concerns about privacy and data collection has been noted by some historians. Crawford created what amounted to a database of sensitive personal information that he then exploited for power and profit, similar to how personal data collected by corporations or governments can be misused. The difficulty of destroying information once it has been recorded, and the impossibility of ever being completely certain that information is secure, were problems in 1889, just as they are in the digital age. The cultural context of 19th century Appalachian Protestantism helps explain some aspects of how Crawford was able to operate successfully for so long. The religious culture emphasized personal sin and guilt, creating an environment where people felt strong pressure to confess and to seek forgiveness. The isolation of mountain communities meant limited contact with outside religious authorities who might have noticed problems with Crawford's practice. The economic precarity of mountain life meant people were vulnerable to financial exploitation and had limited ability to risk their reputations by challenging powerful community figures like pastors. The gender dynamics of Crawford's abuse are significant, though they were not emphasized in the immediate aftermath of his exposure. His journals document that he particularly exploited women's confessions, using knowledge of sexual indiscretions or of family conflicts to maintain control over women who had few legal rights and who were highly vulnerable to reputation damage in their communities. Crawford's abuse of women's confessions reflects broader patterns of how religious authority was used to reinforce gender hierarchies and to control women's autonomy. The question of whether any of Crawford's recorded confessions documented serious crimes that should have been reported to civil authorities was complicated by the lack of mandatory reporting requirements in 1889. His journals apparently documented confessions that in modern context would trigger mandatory reporting, child abuse, domestic violence, possibly even murder. But in 1889 there was no legal obligation for clergy to report crimes revealed in confession, and the ethic of pastoral confidentiality would have been understood to prevent such reporting, even if it had been legally required. The long-term outcomes for Crawford's victims varied widely. Some were able to rebuild their lives and their trust in religious community, eventually finding spiritual homes in churches where they felt safe. Others never recovered psychologically from the betrayal, carrying lasting trauma and inability to trust that affected their religious lives, their families, and their broader social relationships. Several victims left statements or letters describing how Crawford's abuse had killed their faith, destroying their ability to believe in a loving God when God's supposed representative had been so cruel. The memorial service held for the victims of Crawford's abuse in 1895, 6 years after his exposure, provided some measure of community healing. The service, conducted by Reverend Green, acknowledged the harm that had been done and provided space for collective grief over the betrayal of trust. The service included symbolic burning of blank journals representing the destruction of the power that written records of confession had held over the community. While actual destruction of Crawford's journals would have been controversial, the symbolic destruction provided cathartic release for many victims. The impact of the Crawford case on broader Baptist practice and governance was modest, but real. Baptist associations in Kentucky and surrounding states developed more formal oversight procedures for individual churches and pastors, creating mechanisms for intervention when pastoral abuse was suspected. The case was referenced in pastoral training as an example of how spiritual authority could be abused, and of the importance of maintaining appropriate boundaries in pastoral relationships. These institutional responses didn't fully prevent future cases of clergy abuse, but provided some additional safeguards. The folk memory of the Crawford case in Harlan persisted for generations, with stories about the preacher who kept the books being passed down as cautionary tales about trust, and about the danger of concentrating too much power in individual religious leaders. By the late 20th century, specific memories of Crawford and his victims had faded, but the cultural memory of betrayal by trusted religious authority remained part of how Harlan's community understood their religious history and their relationship with organized religion. The church building where Crawford served, and where his basement study contained the journals, was eventually demolished in 1923, when Harlan Baptist built a new, larger church building on a different site. Some congregation members expressed relief at the demolition, feeling that the old building carried too much traumatic history to continue serving as a place of worship. The basement where Crawford had kept his journals was filled in and covered, symbolically burying the physical space that had been the center of his system of abuse and control. Modern research into the psychology of confession and of pastoral relationships has provided some understanding of why Crawford's exploitation was so damaging. Confession involves revealing one's most shameful acts and thoughts to another person, creating extreme vulnerability that requires absolute trust to be psychologically safe. When that trust is betrayed, as Crawford betrayed his congregation's trust, the psychological damage extends beyond the immediate harm to fundamental capacity to trust and to experience appropriate spiritual relationships. Crawford's victims didn't just lose trust in him, they lost the ability to engage in confessional practices that can serve important psychological and spiritual functions when conducted ethically. The question of what motivated Crawford to spend 14 years systematically recording and exploiting confessions has never been fully answered. His journals document the practice, but provide limited insight into his psychology or motivations beyond his expressed contempt for his congregation and his apparent pleasure in possessing their secrets. Some psychological interpretations suggest he may have been compensating for feelings of powerlessness or inadequacy by accumulating power over others. Others suggest he may have had antisocial personality characteristics that made him incapable of empathy and comfortable with exploitation. Without more personal biographical information, his motivations remain speculative. The descendants of Crawford's victims, who are aware of their family connection to the case, often carry complex feelings about that history. Some feel pride that their ancestors eventually stood up to Crawford and exposed his abuse. Others feel shame that family members were victimized and that family secrets were documented. Most feel ambivalence, recognizing both the courage it took to confront Crawford and the stigma associated with having been his victims. These complex inherited feelings demonstrate how trauma can extend across generations, even when specific details of that trauma aren't fully known. The sealed journals remain a source of anxiety for some descendants who worry that they might eventually be leaked or made public, exposing their ancestors' confessions to contemporary scrutiny. The custodians of the journals have repeatedly affirmed their commitment to maintaining the seal, but as time passes, and as the journals become more distant historically, pressure increases to treat them as historical documents rather than as private records requiring protection. This tension between historical interest and privacy protection will likely intensify as all direct descendants of Crawford's victims pass away, raising questions about how long privacy protections should extend after death. The case of Reverend Isaiah Crawford and his 14 years of recording and exploiting confessions in Harlan, Kentucky, stands as one of the most comprehensive documented cases of spiritual abuse in 19th century America. The detailed journals Crawford kept provided evidence of systematic betrayal of pastoral trust that affected hundreds of people across 14 years. His abuse was made possible by the isolation of the community he served, by the trust that pastoral authority commanded, and by the lack of oversight or accountability structures that might have identified and stopped his behavior earlier. The more than 100 families whose confessions Crawford documented and whose vulnerabilities he exploited between 1875 and 1889 were victims of someone who used sacred trust as a tool for control and personal gain. Crawford's suicide prevented him from facing full accountability, but the exposure of his journals and the community's efforts to address the harm he caused provided some measure of justice and healing, however incomplete. What happened in that church basement in Harlan between 1875 and 1889, the systematic recording of confessions, the calculated exploitation of secrets, the destruction of trust, demonstrates how religious authority can be weaponized by those who lack genuine pastoral calling and who view their congregation as resources to be exploited rather than as people to be served and protected.